Hello, everybody. So, I wanted to spend some time thinking about how science is funded, because historically, what we've seen is there's been basically three ways in which science has been funded. Kind of started off with private patrons, then governmental agencies, and corporations. So, basically, when we think about the beginnings of science, we think of, some scientists working, go finding a rich, member of the nobility or some rich guy, and they would, ask them for money, and then, the scientists would provide the patron with some sort of benefits at times. But a great example of this is Alexander Graham Bell, the guy who invented the telephone. And essentially, what happened was he needed someone to help fund his research on making the telephone work, right? And there's a kind of an interesting story. He had an undergraduate worker working in his lab. Her name was Mabel Hubbard, and Mabel's father was very wealthy, and so Alexander Graham Bell eventually married Mabel and then asked her father to help fund the company that eventually became the Bell Telephone Company. The Bell Telephone Company, if you know anything about that, actually turned into AT&T, so it was a very successful company, and so potentially Mabel Hubbard was not necessarily married for, well, there's some question whether Alexander Graham Bell married her for her father's money or for her. But that was just kind of the model for a long time, where scientists, engineers, whatever, would go find rich people and get them to fund their projects. After, in the 20th century, what we basically see is governmental funding really starts to increase, because the government realizes that funding science is a really important thing. The biggest current funding agencies are kind of right here: National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, Department of Defense does a lot of science development. Yes, a lot of it is on weapons and defense technologies and things like that, but they still do a lot of fundamental research too. So, we think about NASA all the time, but even departments like the Department of Agriculture do a lot of funding of science. Now, if we look at kind of how the last 60, 70 years of funding has been, what we see is there has been this pretty drastic increase of governmental funding. Now, this is non-defense, okay? So this is research and development dollars. And I believe this is, constant fiscal year dollar, so it is basically take inflation into account. But what we see is there's been lots of increases. The blue line here is health. You can see the yellow line here is space, so that's basically NASA, and not too surprisingly, the 1960s had that big increase with the Apollo program, but then it really decreased since then. So we've got energy research. Natural resources is not very much, and then general science is kind of just everything put together. So this is the U.S. budget, right? And we see, there's been this increase. Well, that's been great. But if we look at it as a percentage of the federal budget, it has really decreased, okay? So this is non-defense spending, and then research and development, and then this is with defense spending put into there. And really what we see then is, as far as like the percentage of the total U.S. budget that goes into research and development, has been decreasing. If you look at it by agency, then what we see is the Department of Defense gets the overwhelming majority of research and development dollars. Then the National Institutes of Health gets the second most. Then we got Department of Energy. Here's NASA, National Science Foundation, and a bunch of other things, right? This red bar here is the American Restoration and Recovery Act that was following the 2008 financial crisis. So that's kind of the picture of how much money, how much we value science here in the United States. Now, what we see then is really from federal spending has been pretty flat, at least certainly since like 2000. We've seen some, increases a little bit in the last 70 years, but this industry funded science has really, really increased. And this is where we're seeing most of the money going to into science is from corporations, from industry. And I don't want to say we're gonna spend some time thinking about the conflicts of interest that corporate sponsored science has. I don't want to say that that's a bad thing, right? I like having an iPhone. An iPhone wouldn't exist unless the Apple company put in millions and millions of dollars to try to make the best iPhone ever, right? So that's not really a problem per se, but let's think about this here for a second. So corporate sponsorship does about 75% of clinical medical trials, and that is that's a lot, right? And it's overwhelmingly done by these companies. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. These 9 companies do, of that 75%, the 9 companies do most of that clinical medical trials. And these are the big pharmaceutical companies that are making new drugs, and it costs a lot of money to bring a drug to market. To bring a new drug, it's somewhere around $1 billion. That was with a B, right? And so it's not necessarily surprising that only 9 companies really in the world are responsible for most of the medical trials of new drugs. But it does become a problem because, when we see this little cartoon, I think, shows it. 9 out of 10 doctors on our payroll recommend this product, right? So if it costs $1 billion to bring a drug to market, it might not be that surprising that these companies might try to make their product better than it actually seems. And a great example of this is the medication Claritin, right? It's for seasonal allergies, hay fever and mold and pollen, that kind of thing. And this drug really became popular. It came out of the market in early to mid 90s, and it was made during that time about $2 billion in annual sales. Now that's great. That's a lot of money. The company did well with this. The cost in the U.S. at the time was about $80 a month. Since the drug has gone generic, it's a little bit cheaper, probably like $30 a month to take it, maybe less than that. But so this was a very successful medication, at least from a business standpoint. Some of you may have taken it, not sure, right? I took it as a child, and I didn't really think it did anything, so we stopped taking it. So when we look at some of the science, they said people who took Claritin saw 46% improvement. Okay, that's great. I'm not sure if that's like 46%. I think what it is 46% of the people saw improvement. Now, if a drug works for 46% of the people, that's great. But the thing is, the placebo in the same study had 35%. Another study looked at 43 and 32 versus the placebo. And another study found that 37 to 47% of placebo patients showed good or excellent response to the treatment. Now, what's the deal here, right? Allergies are really subjective, and people can kind of ignore symptoms. So maybe it's a function of the illness that this is trying to treat, but it's still, is Claritin actually a good drug? And the answers might be, I don't know, right? So what we see with Claritin then is the patent was extended until 2002, but right in 2001, this new drug came out by the same company called Clarinex, and they build it as this active metabolite of Claritin. Basically, what your body does is the active drug in Claritin is called loratadine, and the active metabolite of Claritin, basically what your body does is it ingests the loratadine, changes it to this thing called desloratadine, and then it uses it and it does its thing. And put together Claritin, Clarinex right now, somewhere due around $1 billion a year of annual sales. The thing is, active metabolites don't really show any difference. They don't show any improvement in symptoms over just the normal drug. So the company kind of built Clarinex as this idea or as this drug that would be able to get into your body faster and do its thing because your body didn't need to change it over to loratadine or desloratadine from loratadine, right? And the drug really doesn't work any better. And so why are these companies putting out these drugs? And the answer is that $1 billion a year, right? There's a huge incentive to put out new drugs, and they might not work super great. For some people, the drug does work. Claritin works really well, but once you put in all this money to try to develop a drug, they want to be able to make their money back. And some of the studies are showing that they probably shouldn't necessarily be using these drugs or promoting them as much as they do. So when we see this huge increase in industry science, it should give you concern at least, because all of these companies that are doing that are doing research and development to try to make a profit. So are they necessarily putting out good products that we actually should be using? That might, that's somewhat a personal choice for you. So I kind of want to spend the rest of this lecture thinking about why do you want your money to go to science? Maybe the question is, or the answer for you personally is, I don't want my money to go to science. I really want my money to go to my tax dollars to go to helping hungry people. I don't know what that is, but for me, I would really like to see a decent amount of our tax dollars, more than the 2 to 3% of our national budget, going towards scientific research. So, I'm going to talk about some reasons why we see that the science is, I think, a good thing. Science really changes our worldview, right? So, go back in time, a long time ago, we thought that Earth was flat. It took scientists figuring out these complicated problems to find out, oh, no. Here's what our world is really like. And as we've put more money into science, we can see that our worldview changes, it expands, and we see that we're in, a bigger and bigger place. We might not necessarily know the importance of our science that we're doing until much later. So we should be putting money into science now so that we can reap the benefit much later. So radioactivity was discovered in 1896, and the people that discovered it were like, yeah, this is cool and all, but it doesn't serve any purpose, right? And what we know is that it's actually served a great purpose. Now, the first nuclear reactor came online in 1942. That was generally to create the atomic bomb, but we have since co-opted that technology to make a lot of our electricity. So I believe it's 11% of the electricity in the U.S. Worldwide, there's other countries that almost rely completely on nuclear energy. France is a big one. Japan is a big one. I'm trying to think of the other countries. Can't think of them right now. But it goes to show that it took a really long time before we actually knew how important radioactivity could be to us. And that can be applied to lots of different scientific discoveries that we've made. So we really need to be doing science, because if we want to solve our problems, we really need to get that knowledge now, right? So that the bigger knowledge base that we have now, when a new problem comes along, we'll be able to solve that problem quickly and more completely. I think a great example of this is the ozone hole. This is when I was in elementary school in the early 90s. There was a lot of talk about the ozone hole as this big, huge problem that is going to cause solar radiation to be hitting the Earth, UV radiation. It's going to be really bad. And they tracked it to this thing called chlorofluorocarbons. And it was this chemical that's released into the atmosphere with old aerosol cans and some other things. And it's really, we found that there was CFCs, took them off the market. Basically, there's a worldwide ban, and we can see that the ozone hole is shrinking and getting smaller. And we expect it to be like completely healed within like 30, 40 years, I think. Another example is vaccines, right? So the more research and development that we put into creating an infrastructure to build vaccines quickly, we'll be able to respond to that a lot better. Now, with this recent coronavirus outbreak, I think this was really an interesting topic, because a lot of people had said that our continuous erosion of the Centers for Disease Control and what they do has really hampered our ability to make a response to this coronavirus and make a vaccine that will take a very, very long time. I think from a completely, let's say, economic perspective, what we can see is that spin-off technologies are really important and a really good reason why we should be doing science. So this is just the Wikipedia page for NASA spin-off technologies, and what we can see is, if you look over here, all of the things that have come from NASA science. So infrared ear thermometers, LASIK eye surgery, cochlear implants for deaf people, artificial limbs, invisible braces. What else do we got? Landmine removal, shock absorbers for buildings. So the Tempur-Pedic foam mattresses that we have now. Let me see, what else do we have? A lot of really interesting technologies that we wouldn't have or without the space program. And basically the research to try to solve problems in space were applied to everything else. And what we see is that, let me go back here. What we see is that for the Apollo program, the U.S. government spent a lot of money on that, but for every dollar that they put into the program, it's thought that they got 14. It's estimated that they got 14 returned. So that's a return on investment of 14 to 1, which is amazing. That's great, right? Like, if you can get $14 back for every $1 that you spend, I think that's a really good thing, important way. Good use of our money, should I say. I think knowledge then should just be valuable, right? So maybe it's not necessarily super economic gains that we see, but the base knowledge is pretty valuable. I think I like this quote. It's from an like a country western author, but I think it's spot on. Knowledge is like money. To be of value, it must circulate, and in circulating, it can increase in quantity and hopefully in value. And I think from, maybe just a real cynical point of view, this is Neil deGrasse Tyson, to be scientifically literate is to empower yourself to know when someone else is full of shit, right? So, that's showing us that knowledge, scientific knowledge, is super important so that we can defend what we know to be right, or we can at least at minimum figure out when someone else is using incorrect logic or incorrect data that we can then, the more our society knows about science, the more we can guide our policies to be important. So one thing I want to say is, how can you yourself use the scientific process? Kind of a silly example of what I did is one time I was home for Christmas and we were playing a game of Pictionary, and you have these little timers here. And my family was kind of having a good-natured argument about what's the fastest way to, if you run through half the timer, how do you get all that sand out the quickest, right? So if you have built up sand, how do you get it out the quickest? And some people are like, well, you tap it on the top. My brother said, no, you just leave it, don't do anything. And so I figured it out. I was like, after the game was done, I was like, I'm gonna figure this out. So I timed the timer. My question was, how can we get the sand out of the timer the quickest, right? So I made a hypothesis that tapping, I actually thought that tapping would slow it down, and maybe there was some other way. And so I did a test. I timed it. So I did a control where I just left it on the table just straight up and down. I timed it while tapping it, and then I timed it kind of while swirling it, like if you were drawing a pencil, if you were drawing a circle with a pencil. And what I found that it was about 15% faster if you swirl it. So I just used the scientific process there to figure out a faster way to save my family time while we're playing Pictionary. Now, is that a useful part of my time? Well, I spent 10 minutes on it after when I wasn't doing anything that day while I was on vacation. So potentially, is that knowledge valuable? Maybe. I don't know. Another thing I did was when I bought my new house, I was trying to figure out how to fill the my pots of water quickest, and I had one of those sinks where it had the droplets versus the just the stream of water. And what I actually found out is that it was about 5% faster to fill it up with the spray of water as opposed to the stream. So I used the scientific process there to figure out how to save myself time when I fill up, when I'm making pasta or filling up a pot to cook something, right? I think on a grander scale, though, it's really important that we should be using social policy. We should be using the scientific process in social policy. So there's a lot of thought of trying to do this with recidivism experiments. And recidivism is looking at how often people are readmitted into prison, right? So do we, just let the people go and don't give them any help after they get out of prison? And do we, guide them with job programs with lots of different things? And a lot of people are, pushing for different ideas, but the only way to figure out what is the best way is to do an experiment where you take two competing ideas. You take, all the the inmates that are being released to prison, put them into two different groups and say, okay, we're going to get, do some intervention for group A, and group B, we're going to do some different intervention and see which one does the best. Another example could be with drug rehab programs. So, if someone's addicted to heroin, what type of program works actually the best? This can also be applied to economic policy. We come across some financial crisis. What does the science say? Should we be doing experiments with different groups of people to help and figure out how to grow our economy as best as possible? Another example might be educational decisions. So a lot of educational decisions are made ideologically based rather than evidence based. And there's a lot of push for to figure out how to best educate people, our children, whatever, we should be doing these type of experiments. And then that's the only way for us to then increase our knowledge, increase our ability, and continue to refine our methods. So I think these are three big time examples of how we can really use science in our world. All right, that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you later.